I would like to introduce our first speaker this morning, Dr. Seth Himelhoch, Professor and Chair of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neuroscience at the University of Chicago, a national leader in tobacco control and smoking cessation research. Today, Dr. Himelhoch will share his insights from his work at the intersection of psychiatry, neuroscience, and public health in his presentation titled Behavioral Activation, Exercise, and the Brain's Reward System, Leveraging Physical Activity for Emotional Resilience and Mental Health. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Seth Himelhoch.
Good morning, everyone. Really delighted to be here and wanted to acknowledge two things to begin with. One, you probably heard that as my research really focuses on tobacco control, and the intersection with movement may not be quite clear. And I want to share with you that, many of you probably know this, that sitting is considered the new smoking. And to my mind, that's one big tie-in. But another really important tie-in was a conversation I had with Adele maybe 6 months ago when I first met him. We were Zooming together, and he quickly became aware that I had a treadmill in the background of my office. And part of that treadmill is to remind me that in moments of great stress or anxiety, there's always a place to find relief. And for me, that's moving. Motion leads to enhanced emotion was not a surprise, at least as I was thinking about it. But there are other things that one can do as well. For example, I have a harmonica in my office as well to help me spend some time being musical when other things are feeling frustrating. So the conversation with Adele that I had really got me thinking about what is motion, and how does it impact emotion? I kind of want to share a narrative, a story, at least how I'm putting it all together, and I hope it resonates for all of you as well. So I want to begin with this slide. This poor dog, I really wanted to work out today, but my body said no. And I think when I read this, line, the first question I asked myself was, really, does the body say no? And in certain circumstances, it's true. The body could say no if you're like extremely fatigued or you have a broken bone or something like that. But oftentimes it has to do more with what you're thinking and how you're feeling, and also the motivation that you bring to exercise. So the first part of the talk is really asking the question, what's going on in the brain, and how can we think about the brain as a place of motivation? And as you know, the brain is an organ that weighs about 3 pounds and has in it 85 billion neurons with hundreds of millions of connections, some of which we understand, some of which we don't understand. There's been many opportunities to look at the brain from different perspectives, histologically, looking at different cells as they move through the brain, and often known as Brodmann areas, or just like areas of the brain, like the frontal lobe, the temporal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, or even deeper brain structures, right? So this is a fabulous organ that we know a little bit about and often want to know a lot more. So I'm going to share with you just one part of the brain that I think is going to connect up with many things that I hope to talk about today. But first, I just want to orient you. So in the middle is just a picture of the side. It kind of looks like a boxing glove. But the part that I really want to focus on is this view. This is a mid-sagittal view. So if you take the brain and you cut it in half and then you look inside the brain, this is the structures that you start seeing. And why that's helpful is because I want to spend time talking about the reward circuit within the brain, because this is going to, I think, help tie in a lot of ideas as I move through this talk. And you can probably see with the arrows that the reward circuitry begins in the area called the ventral tegmental area, which is in the midbrain. And it's the primary source of dopamine for the brain, and particularly for this circuit. Why is dopamine important? Dopamine is important because it's the happiness molecule, right? That's the thing that leads, you know, to people feeling happy potentially. But more in a scientific level, it really is the part that leads to incentive salience or the feeling of wanting. So if you have dopamine in this circuit, the feeling that one would have would be to want something. And that gets conveyed through the mesolimbic dopamine pathway, as well as the mesocortical dopamine pathway. So at the beginning, there's dopamine, and it moves up to the prefrontal cortex through these different pathways. And just as an example, going back to my work as a tobacco control researcher, nicotine is really important. In fact, the name, the nicotinic receptor, was named after nicotine. And it's an interesting story about why that got its name. And I'm not going to go into it right now. You could ask me about it later. But I'm illustrating here that if nicotine connects to the acetylcholine receptor, then the dopamine is, put forward, and that then in green enhances that wanting response, right? So nicotine is a real accelerator to the reward circuitry. And smoking obviously is a part of allowing people to feel that wanting feeling. So what about the prefrontal cortex? So that's the second part of it. And its goal is to integrate tasks and goals and then create a value about them. And then hopefully, like in a looping pattern, send that information back to the mesolimbic region. So that's where you get the circuit, right, of the reward mechanism within the brain. Starts in the ventral tegmental area, goes up to the prefrontal cortex, and then the prefrontal cortex sends it back down to the ventral tegmental area of the brain. So in a very simple way, the reward mechanism is a balance between motivation, which is top down from the prefrontal cortex, and wanting, which is a bottom up response. That's important because when that balance is met, then you have an active and functioning reward circuit. I now want to skip to talking about major depression because I want to share the connection between the reward mechanism with the symptoms of major depression. So, as many of you know, major depression is a syndrome, and it's made up of various symptoms. And the first part is you have to have at least depressed mood or anhedonia. That's a prerequisite of the diagnosis of major depression. So I want to go on a quick, really a short side quest to talk about what is anhedonia. Anhedonia was first used in the late 19th century to really define a behavior where people didn't feel like they wanted to do something. And here I've indicated the inability to experience pleasure from activities that are typically enjoyable. And that's important because I think it's going to connect up with what we're going to be talking about later about movement and exercise. But it's also important because, as you see, it's a cardinal symptom of depression. Depression also has to include at least 5 symptoms, and there are 9 symptoms listed there. So you have to have one, either depressed mood and anhedonia. You could have both, but you have to have at least one, and then at least 4 other symptoms. And these symptoms must occur each day, most of the day, for at least 2 weeks. So there's a period of having it. It's not just reacting to a stressor and feeling down or blue, but it's really a sustained low mood with other symptoms that are described below. And I want to make this point because it's a really important one, which is the pathophysiology of major depression has no single model or mechanism that can explain all aspects of the disease. I'm just putting that out there right now because I'm going to start focusing in on the reward mechanism. but I don't want to give the impression that that's really all that's going on in depression. So the question, so if we know that how the reward system works, and we understand basically what major depression is, the next question is what's going on in the brain's reward circuit with major depression? So again, we talked about this very maybe simple way of understanding that there's a balance between motivation and wanting, and that wanting can be enhanced by dopaminergic releases. What happens with depression? So the first part of it is that there's potentially a loss of excitatory control to the subcortical reward structures from the prefrontal cortex. And that could lead to decreased motivation. So if we think about the dog at the beginning whose body didn't really want to work, you can see there's part of the description or the pathway of depression. And you could have aberrant processing of reward and adverse events that lead to decrease in wanting. So you can actually have both things happening at once, where you could have decreased motivation, decreased wanting, and then you can see how that could be a little bit of a vicious spiral to continue to have a low mood. So the balance between wanting and motivation becomes upended, and suddenly you have, the circuit working very poorly, where people may not feel like they want to do much, and they might feel like they don't want to do much at the very same time. And then you get this: motivation is zero. So the next step is really to understand, well, what can you do to undo that feeling of anhedonia or lack of motivation? And one really important way to manage that is a evidence-based treatment called behavioral activation. And behavioral activation is really, if you're going to boil it down to kind of essential parts, it's really using this idea that there's a vicious cycle of depression, and that there are three things that lead to people's feeling low. There's their emotional feeling, right? Feeling depressed. There are things that they can do, right? And there are things that and ways that they can think. It's not possible really to change the way you feel. You can't really tell yourself, if you're depressed, stop feeling depressed. And you can tell yourself, if I do something, I know that it'll make me feel better. And if that feeling better could lead to better positive thoughts about themselves, then you end up having like the positive cycle, right? Of getting someone to feel better. So here you can see the place where behavioral activation really makes sense is where someone says, I don't want to do anything. And that may come from apathy, it could be from anhedonia. And you challenge yourself to do something, and then that lets you feel better and have better thoughts about, your success and ability to do it. And then that virtuous cycle then builds over time. So when you start thinking about behavioral activation, where does that work in the brain? We know that we'll see in a moment that behavioral activation is very effective, but what part of the brain is it working with? And it turns out it's, if you have an intact response to rewards, right? Meaning your reward mechanism is working, or if you have a defective reward function, meaning you're not feeling the wanting, you're not feeling the motivation, then behavioral activation can be a very powerful tool, because it seems to lead to activation of the prefrontal cortex, leading to, right, a response to the midbrain and getting that whole reward mechanism working again. And if that's true, that's a very powerful thing, because that can help reduce the feelings, for example, of anhedonia. So the question then is, if it's true that maybe this is working through the reward mechanism and behavioral activation can help reduce anhedonia, then what do we know about the treatment effects and how good of a treatment it is? Well, one way we can do this is looking at, synthesized data where people can take the results from many different trials and kind of synthesize them in a meta-analysis. And this is one meta-analysis that was done in 2000, I think it was 2013. So it's, 2020. So here, what we're going to see is if you take all these studies, right, together, and add them up, where you weigh them based on the number of patients that are in each trial. So trials that are more people are going to have more weight because their confidence intervals for their studies are going to be closer, right? And if you add up all those studies together and you use a the standard mean difference, or looking at the effect size, and this effect size is the standard mean difference of depressive symptom reduction, you can see that the effect size is pretty big. So it's a medium effect size, suggesting that this type of treatment for depression is actually very effective. So now we get to the main point, which is exercise and mood. So how do we, at least how I was trying to understand the connection between exercise and mood, again, thinking about how it connects to, the reward mechanism and potentially behavioral activation. So one thing that many of you know, and I kind of stumbled on and thought was very interesting, is how exercise is connected to the tryptophan peripheral metabolism. So tryptophan is an amino acid that leads to the creation of indoles and serotonin. So it's kind of the building block of both of those. And it's also amino acid, so it can build other proteins. So that's an important thing. And you can imagine that tryptophan may need to be broken down at times. And this is where the story with exercise gets, I think, very interesting. So if you follow the cyanuric acid pathway, that's the breakdown of tryptophan, there have been studies that have suggested that depending on whether or not, well, let me back up. If you are in a stressful environment, there are potentially two pathways that tryptophan can then be broken down. One is in the absence of that exercise, and I'm going to move to the next slide just to show it, that the breakdown of the kynurenine, that then crosses the blood-brain barrier and leads to more depressive symptoms. So there is an enhanced depressogenic activity that's related to tryptophan breakdown in the absence of exercise. And with exercise, instead of going to kynurenine, it can get translated into cyanuric acid, which doesn't then cross the blood-brain barrier and therefore might decrease, right, the depressogenic effects of this tryptophan mechanism, which is really interesting because it suggests that there's something peripheral that's happening in the body that's then leading to the brain acting better. And movement is a very important part of that. And to many ways, that makes sense. The body is meant to move, and you would imagine that you'd want to have positive feedback when you are moving. But that's not all. That's just one part of the description of the of this, how exercise influences mood as you think about it, the brain. There's reduction in inflammation is another part. We've already talked about enhancing dopamine is another part. And then the third one, which I'm highlighting here, is, looking at the reward mechanism as well. So again, exercise seems to create this loop within the reward circuitry, which can then enhance mood. So in some ways, movement is impactful in many different ways, right? You get the reward mechanism, dopamine, inflammation, and then also the tryptophan metabolism. So there's a lot going on that could help someone feel better. So if we stop and think about what is the efficacy of exercise for the treatment of depression? So again, we're not just talking about mood, but for the treatment of the syndrome depression. And if we look at the Cochrane Library database again, if we're looking at meta-analyses of adding up all the clinical trials and seeing where they end up, you can find that the many more trials than for behavioral activation listed here. And you can see that at least I think this is in 2013, the result is a medium effect size. So the standard mean difference is the same here. It's looking at the difference of change in mood symptoms over time. And you can see we end up with the same kind of result, which is a medium effect size. I thought that 2013 felt a little too far away, and it is probably important to find something more recent. So this is data that was published in 2024 looking at exercise for depression. And here we see a very similar outcome with if you look at walking or jogging, you can see that the outcome is a medium effect size that looks almost identical to the one from 2013. But if you start looking at the effect sizes of other common treatments, I think you'll see that it's in very good company with other things that one might think is helpful for the treatment of depression. Okay, so we'll stop there and then move on. So you might want to ask the question, what happens if you compare behavioral activation and exercise for major depression? Like where do they fall out? So again, if we talked about the for behavioral activation, it's a medium effect. And if you look at exercise, it's also a medium effect. So very similar. And in many ways, you can sort of argue that exercise in of itself is a form of behavioral activation, right? So to me, this is kind of a very nice thing to see that both of these things seem to be working with the same effect. Okay, now I want to switch into something that's a little different, because then it occurred to me, what do we know about treatments that are behavioral in origin, but don't have any movement, right? We're not asking someone to move at all. So what does that look like? And the one that came up for me was mindfulness. And as many of you know, mindfulness is a non-judgmental attention to present moment experiences way of using the mind or the brain to recalibrate how it's assessing itself in certain situations. You might imagine that mindfulness might be really good for people that are feeling a lot of stress, maybe anxiety type symptoms, because it's offering a way to center oneself, to focus and imagine that the world is open and not maybe predefined by our own expectations. And it allows us to have thoughts that are not connected necessarily to the world in which we are in. And for example, many of you know this probably, but one of the common techniques is just to, get your mind to settle, which is really hard. For me, it took almost 5 years to settle my mind. I could meditate for maybe 3 or 4 minutes. And what was very helpful to me during that period was just to imagine like a river and then having my thoughts just flow down that river. Eventually, I could get up to 40 minutes, and I'm happy to say I can do that now, and feels very good. But to get there took a lot of work, right? Maybe a lot of exercise of the brain in a different way. I'm sharing that because I was curious about what are the effect sizes, or first of all, what does this look like in the brain? Is it different than behavioral activation and exercise? And if we take all of the studies, again, looking at treatment effects, what kind of effect size would we end up with? And what would that look like compared to behavioral activation and exercise? So again, here you're seeing a sagittal view of the brain on the left, and then just a kind of a medial view of the brain that looks like a boxing glove. So the sagittal view is the brain's cut in half, and the view on to the right is the intact full brain, but looking at it from the medial side. So there are several areas that the brain seems to, or areas that are activated by the brain through meditation. So one is intention control, and that would make sense because what are you doing when you meditate? You're just focusing your attention. Another is self-awareness. The idea that, again, you're allowing yourself to take in senses or maybe things in your environment, but not necessarily react to them. So you're aware, but not necessarily reacting. And you can see here different areas of the brain are kind of lighting up for that. And then finally, emotional regulation, right? So how you're able to regulate your feelings. And that also makes sense because I started with mindfulness might be very good for people with anxious feelings or, ideas like that. What you don't see is the reward mechanism lighting up. That seems to be missing. So that's not what mindfulness is doing. And if we ask the question again, like, how does mindfulness, what is its effect relative, to the treatments? So you can see here a lot less treatments that are offered. The data that we have is not as robust for behavioral activation or exercise. So limited numbers of studies. And if you look at the effect size, it's pretty similar. Again, it's in the medium range, which in some ways is very comparable to the ones that we saw before. So what does it all mean? I'm trying to come to a summary of all this. We've taken a tour of the sort of reward mechanism within the brain. We've talked about how that reward mechanism can look different under the influence of depression, the wanting and the motivation going down. We've talked about the central role of anhedonia, the feeling of not wanting to do something pleasurable, and how behavioral activation, through really focusing on doing pleasurable activities, can undo that feeling of anhedonia and lead to reduction in depressive symptoms. And we've seen clearly that, at least for behavioral activation, there's a medium effect for that treatment. With motion or exercise writ large, it appears that there's a very similar pattern, right, where the brain, there's the activation of the reward mechanism and leading to reduction in depressive symptoms. Again, potentially mediated by the reward mechanism with the addition of the tryptophan mechanism or metabolism as well. And so I just wanted to share kind of some summaries based on that. If we look at behavioral activation and exercise, and we think about the brain region that's activated and the symptom dimension that seems to be a focus, there seems to be a big overlap. And there also seems to be, in terms of the effect size, right, a pretty strong effect, which is great. Mindfulness seems to be working in a very different way, yet it still has the same sort of effect size, right? A medium to almost a large effect size, but it seems to be working maybe in a different way. Remember, we were talking about attention, self-awareness, and maybe rumination is maybe the key to that, right? Where people are just thinking about things over and over again. So the reason I'm bringing that forward is that for some people, right, it's possible that not moving is actually something that can allow them to be successful. And I also just want to point out that all these interventions seem to have effect sizes that are all very similar, which is really important. It means that the evidence base is pretty strong for each one of these interventions. And in some ways, what that means, at least in my mind, is it all depends on what's needed. Different people are going to require different things. And some people, are going to benefit greatly from behavioral activation, exercise to lead to decreased depression. But there might be other people that might do much better with mindfulness as a way to help them with the symptom control that they're looking for. So that is, I gave a lot of time for questions, but I hope that that offers a way of thinking about um, exercise within the realm of behavioral activation. And I think a useful contrast of having mindfulness as a way to think about other types of people that might benefit from maybe less active treatments depending on their need. So I'm going to stop there and thank everyone for their time and attention, and very happy to take questions and very interested in hearing what all of you think about this. Because as I said at the beginning, I'm really a tobacco control researcher. Pun intended, this was a bit of a stretch for me, and it was a lot of fun to dig in and really think about this. So I'm really happy to be part of the conversation about this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. If anybody has some questions, we do have some time, and I'll just remind you that we have a microphone right here. You could come on over if that's possible.
Hi.
Now we're on. What was it? Hi, good morning. Thank you so much for your presentation. I noticed you had a lot of dog photos in your presentation. I'm not sure if you noticed my shirt.
What does your shirt say?
The future is canine.
I love that.
So, my name is Cindy Brosick. I'm a registered nurse. I do private practice with animal assisted therapy as my intervention for children with ADHD, post PTSD. Anyways, I've been dying to know, and this, I think you're the perfect person, is I noticed on one of your slides you talked about uh, medications. So how can we, it looked like the interventions for like the mindfulness and exercise, how does that compare to pharmacology as far as treating depression or anxiety?
Yeah, that's a great question. As many of you know, behavioral interventions seem to have a much larger effect size than medication. So the real, but and you're asking a really good question, which is with whom is that going to be important? So, when people enter into, let's say, having major depression for their first time, um, that that information is really important because people can probably choose what's the best treatment for them. And that might include all those things. And people, at least in my experience, are pretty clear about what they want and what they don't want. Sometimes people want medication because to them it's easier to take a pill than to, do something that requires a lot more motivation or, as Adele says, adherence and accountability, which are tough. When people get onto like more extreme forms of depression, then medication might have a bigger role to play and other types of interventions. But if we're just talking about garden variety depression, I think there's a lot of opportunity.
Yeah, I guess I see in my practice that it's funny because when kids come in to see me, the first thing they do is they take their shoes off. They're just, and they see the dog or the horse or what have you. And what I struggle with though is, we're sometimes when the kids come to see me after school, maybe their medications have kind of died off, and the parents have told me, like, holy cow, I can't believe they're maintaining their attention with you and the dog or you and the horse. And then at times too, I struggle because I see kids that, have a little bit more behavioral problems and they're titrating medications. And now they're coming to me and they can't even focus because of the medications. And I'm trying to find that balance. Maybe it's educating, or I don't know how to help if that
Yeah.
makes sense.
So, with ADHD in particular, because I think that's what you're talking about,
Yeah.
medication can be part of the answer, but it's not the whole answer. And there's so much more going on for kids that, and some kids don't really like the medication. right? And so that's a whole different issue. So doing other approaches like what you're doing, I think makes good sense to figure out what is the range of things that you can be brought to help a kid enjoy life. And some of it could just be contextual as well, right? I don't know if I've answered your question.
Thank you. It's a
Okay.
tough one. I know it's a kind of a loaded question. So thank you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you. Hi, Jake.
Oh, how are you?
Good.
Hey, that was awesome. I loved your perspective and the way that you sort of bring in the neuroscience to try to understand like why is this working, how is it working, when is it working, for whom is it working, and that like triggers a bunch of things in my head of where do we go from here and what makes the most sense next. And one of the things that we see often in exercise research is that when you add exercise to another intervention, often you don't get more bang for your buck than you did from just doing either exercise or SSRIs or whatever on their own. Oftentimes the integration doesn't seem to get us a whole lot of extra effect size or benefit. And, you know, in my kinesiology brain, that means like, let's just exercise and then we don't have to think about the other stuff. But that's sort of like a simplistic way of thinking about it. And I think some of the data that you showed really makes me think about the way that exercise might work and the way that something like mindfulness might work. And if they're sort of targeting different systems in the brain, do you want to speak a little bit about the way that those two things might be able to be intervened on simultaneously, and what you might think that that might be able to do?
That is a great question and a great idea. Early in my career, I've also spent a fair amount of time working with people who live with HIV. And as you might know, the great revolution in the treatment of HIV happened because someone said, we shouldn't just use one drug. We should use 3 drugs looking at like that are focused on 3 different mechanisms within the virus. And that was the key to solving that problem, right? And everything from that point in 96 onward was just refining it to make it tolerable and easy for people to use. So combining treatments makes a lot of sense to me, particularly if they're not overlapping, right? Like that's your point. And I think that's right on. I don't have any information to suggest that would work or not, but we do have like a history of things like that working. And I want to add one other thing, which is there is a intervention that it's probably not novel anymore. It's called transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS. And the thing that TMS does is it takes the magnet, transduces electricity to the surface of the brain, and then can upregulate or downregulate certain circuits within the brain. There are deep like structures within the brain that can also have that upregulation or downregulation. And there are TMS machines now that do the deeper brain stimulation. One thing that you brought up, like this is like just communication. Like I thought, what if you primed the pump, right? If motivation, that first slide, like my body doesn't want to do it. What if you could prime the pump with some, electrical stimulation to get people feeling like, yeah, this would feel good, right? Either connected to the exercise or right, like somehow get that connected. That might be of interest too, because TMS in general, people don't feel anything. It's not harmful. There's no anesthesia involved. It's not medication, but it could be helpful. So I'm just playing with ideas with you. That's all.
Great. Yes. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Oh, sure. Thank you.
So I had almost the exact same question, maybe because we're both kinesiologists, in thinking about the combination of therapies and the mechanisms. So since he already asked that one, my second question was, and you might have already answered this, do we know which combination would work for which person? So we know that there's different pathophysiology of depression. Do we have any sort of idea of who exercise having more tailored prescriptions, that exercise will work really great for this individual versus mindfulness for this one? Or is it all down to just preference? I would prefer to exercise versus I would prefer to do more mindfulness.
So this is just my understanding. It appears that anhedonia is a very big, as we talked about with major depression, you have to have at least depression and or anhedonia. And if someone really has a lot of anhedonic symptoms, and you can tell that usually because they have a hard time getting to the appointment, they don't want to do things. You don't want to fight with people, but you know, to tell them, you know, if you do pleasurable things, it might feel better. But it seems to me that this kind of, you know, these kind of symptoms seem to be much more uh, um, um, tailored to these kind of interventions. So if you're leading with anhedonia, it might be that these might be better. Whereas I think people who are ruminating and having trouble and things like that with their depression, and maybe anhedonia is not their thing, that might be better with mindfulness. So that's my takeaway, but I don't know if that will hold up, you know, to examination. We'll have
Great
to see.
hypothesis, yeah. And then I guess going back to the combination therapy, it'd also be interesting, you know, in study designs, they have more smart designs where you might start with one
Yes.
intervention, and then if it's not working as well or they're not responding, then you step up and add a second intervention. That might also be helpful in seeing the different.
I think that's a great idea. And, you know, those kind of smart trials have been done with other things in depression, medication, behavioral. Okay, great. Hi.
Hi, thanks. Also had a similar question. So my follow-up question is, with a lot of the meta-analysis that you were showing, I'm curious about what the duration of time the exercise was for a couple of reasons. One, for a lot of people, exercise, there's lots of different types of exercise, right? And there's a tremendous amount of discipline that goes into it. So there's a mindfulness aspect of just maintaining the protocol. I guess I'm also interested in knowing if it was individual or if they were in a group.
Yes.
Because that's going to impact their symptoms of depression too. And I guess where that leads me to, and for context, I'm in counseling, but I'm also a personal trainer. I've been working in the fitness industry for 15 years.
Great.
And so what I typically see is that there is sort of, I don't want to get the engine going, but then once the engine starts perpetuating, it just becomes habit, right? And then the habit, 6 weeks later, is great. With medication, you can say you should start to feel relief maybe within 48 hours and then really in 2 weeks, and you're going to come to your follow-up appointment in 2 weeks to see if we have the dosage correct. I haven't seen too much by way of exercise of saying we can give you a reasonable estimate of when you're going to start feeling better. And I feel like that could get people much more on board with the protocol if we were able to say it takes reasonably about this much time to feel X% better. And I don't think that's because we can't measure it. I think it just hasn't been measured well. So I was wondering what your perspective or what you've seen in research, if we were to offer some sort of hope about timeline.
Yeah. So I'll start with you. First of all, thank you. And I really want to share my great enthusiasm for the work that you do. So I think, so in that meta-analysis, you're right. There are different types of exercise. There was different durations and there are different formats. And the one I was showing you was looking at not really taking that into account. It's just like there were different. Okay, that's better. There were different sensitivity analyses that were done to look at just the questions you asked. And what I recall is that no matter how you sliced it up, things were kind of in the medium effect size. So I'm happy to share the citation with you, or you can just go to Cochrane and just type it in yourself. But that's my memory of it. So the answer to your question is correct. It is correct. Those were just all in.
Yeah. Do you know, and I could just go look it up, but like the timeline, I think is really
Well, it's coming to mind with 6 weeks, but it's like 6 to 8 weeks. That's what's in my head.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. Does that sound right to you?
That's about how much it would take.
Yeah. Okay. That's what I remember. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
So go ahead and ask your question, please. And then we'll wrap it up right after that. And we'll.
Thanks for a very informative presentation. I always like to see the molecular and cellular biology in addition to the work with humans and the behavioral work. I had a question. We know that exercise has effects on various aspects of cognition. Some might say broadly But most meta-analyses indicate that some aspects of cognition get bigger effect sizes than others. And one of the aspects of cognition that gets a larger effect size from exercise, be it cardiorespiratory or resistance, is executive function. Executive function has a number of components. Some of them have to do with self-regulation, which
Yes.
might have to do with depression. I'm wondering how synergistic these cognitive effects or effects on executive function and effects on the symptomology of depression might be, and whether anybody's explored that. I don't work in this world. I'm not in tobacco, but I don't work in the field of depression either.
Yeah. So I don't want to like move into places I don't know a lot about.
Sure.
But, the executive area of the brain is also the prefrontal cortex, which, in the reward mechanism, is the kind of motivating part of it. So for depression, there's been a lot of work looking at different areas of the frontal lobe to understand other types of circuitry that might enhance or decrease depressive symptoms. So like the dorsolateral prefrontal area is probably one of them. And I wanted to bring up just another, you've got me thinking about something, which is, heart rate variability is something that is highly connected, right? So if you have low heart rate variability, it has all sorts of bad outcomes, right? Bad outcomes in health, bad outcomes in mood, bad outcomes in behavior. Like it just seems to be everything is connected to it. And how do you change that? Well, you change that with breathing, right? And if you breathe in a different way, then you get a pattern of heart rate variability that's higher variability. And what they found is that not only do you get better outcomes in terms of your mood, but the brain actually gets like bigger. Like it seems to like grow. And I'm just connecting that up with what you're saying, which is, if it is true that through exercise, maybe you're getting that kind of rhythmic and your heart rate variability changes, and that then directly has like impact on executive functioning. How cool would that be?
Yeah.
Again, I'm not a heart rate variability researcher, but I'm just connecting up what you're saying.
Yeah, heart rate variability does change, just as the variability of the blood oxygen level dependent signal in MRI changes. More variability is good in both cases, and the brain does grow both structurally and functionally as a function of exercise. Could I do one more question? Okay.
Sherry, is it okay?
Okay. So, less than a minute. So you listed a number of therapies that would be useful in depression, have about the same effect size. I'm wondering, why not go with multiple therapies? And then it gets more complex because you have to worry about order effects. When I think of the lifestyle field and things like nutrition, intellectual engagement, exercise, stress, et cetera,
yes,
there have been some interesting animal studies that have looked at whether there are order effects when you combine various factors. And Gerd Kemperman from Germany found that start with exercise first, go with intellectual training, even for rodents, and they get smarter faster. Because in a sense, you're priming the pump, you're priming the circuits that would encode new learning. I'm wondering if this might be a possibility with these multiple therapies that you've outlined today in terms of treating depression. Combining them might work better, might not. And even if you combine them, order might be important. Thanks.
Yeah, so that's a great way to end. Fully agree. And I think that if that's the question, what's your name? I'm sorry. Rebecca. Rebecca had the same kind of question. And Jake, so it seems like that's maybe a place to end, which is, bringing things together to find maybe complementary ways and ordering them in a way to enhance outcomes might be a really important future path. So thank you for getting me to that place of ending. All right. It was great to be with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.